Today we're going to continue our study of Judges in Judges chapter 8, the ending of Gideon's life. Now I have to tell you that I actually tried making this video a few weeks ago, and as soon as we were done I told my husband who records the videos that it wasn't right. There was something that was missing. And so I have waited a little while to finish this, and last night I believe I got the message of exactly what this needed to include. I'm going to begin reading at Judges 8, verse 28. Thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head up again during Gideon's lifetime. The land had peace for 40 years. So if you remember at the end of our last lesson, Gideon defeated the Midianites. Now I'm going to back up just a little bit to something that happened right before Gideon's death. It's very interesting what happened. He goes through a series of people not supporting him any longer, but then things change a little bit. Beginning in verse 22, the Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." This passage right here is very key in that it shows Gideon's heart was still in the right place. And I would like to show you what happened with the Israelites with Gideon. Verse 24, "And he said, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. So they took the plunder from Midian, and Gideon requested that each one of them give up one gold earring. Verse 25, they answered, "We'll be glad to give them." So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. So he made an ephod, which was a priestly garment. Now, what I'd like to do is go back a little bit to explain how the priestly garments happened. If we go back to Exodus, and we're going to go to chapter 39, we're going to talk a little bit about the priestly garments. Beginning in verse 1, "From the blue, purple, and scarlet yarn they made woven garments for ministering in the sanctuary." So the purpose of the ephod, they were priestly garments that were worn to minister in the sanctuary. These were garments for the Levites, the descendants of Aaron. They also made sacred garments for Aaron as the Lord commanded. They made the ephod of gold and of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and of finely twisted linen. They hammered out thin sheets of gold and cut strands to be worked into the blue, purple, and scarlet yarn and fine linen, the work of the skilled hands. They made shoulder pieces for the ephod, which were attached to two of its corners, so it could be fastened. Its skillfully woven waistband was like it, one piece with the ephod, and made with gold, and with blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and with finely twisted linen, as the Lord commanded Moses. So you see that Gideon was following the law of Moses by making this ephod. He made it to the exact specifications that were specified in the book of Exodus. But something interesting then happened. To continue in chapter 8 of Judges, verse 27, the second half of that, all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. So Gideon had made something that God had ordained, that God had told them to make back in Exodus under the Levitical law. But the Israelites used that as an idol. This is not the first time in Israel's history that this happened. If we go to Numbers chapter 21, there's something that I would like to cover here, and something that kind of goes along with this idea. We're going to go to Numbers 21, and beginning in verse 8, we're going to learn of what happened to the Israelites as they wandered in the wilderness. At that time, they were again grumbling against God for bringing them out of Egypt, and they asked Moses, "Why did you bring us out here to die?" This is something that happened on a regular basis, and Moses always corrected them. God always corrected them for their grumblings. Well, this time in verse 6 it says, "The Lord sent venomous snakes among them, and they bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, 'We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us.' So Moses prayed for the people." Then in verse 8, the Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. So you notice what happened there. God ordained for this bronze snake to be made, for Moses to make a snake. This was his method of healing. Moses put it up on a pole, and anyone who looked at this snake was cured of the poisonous snake bite. Now that was definitely a good thing that happened. That is something that God had planned. But I'm going to show you something again. If we go to 2 Kings chapter 18. This again shows the heart of the Israelites, much like happened during the time of Gideon. Now, remember that the time that the brass snake was made, the bronze snake was made, was when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness for those 40 years. They then came to the promised land. They went through the time of the judges that we're studying now. They went through the kings, Saul, David, Solomon, and now we are into Israel's divided kingdom. And this is King Hezekiah, who was one of the few good kings that ruled Judah during this time. We're going to begin in verse 1 of chapter 18 of 2 Kings. Now it came about in the 3rd year of Hoshea, the king of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, became king. Now right now I am reading from the NASB version because I just like the wording of this particular passage in this translation. Verse 2. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. He did right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. We find throughout Israel's divided kingdom so often the kings are measured by David's standards, by the standard that David set, because David was a man after God's own heart. And we see that Hezekiah did all that was right, just as David had done. Now in verse 4, he removed the high places and broke down the sacred pillars and cut down the Asherah. He broke into pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the sons of Israel burned incense to it. So again, just like with Gideon, the Israelites began worshiping this bronze snake that God had made, that he had told Moses to make, that he had ordained. They began worshiping this. Now, that is so typical of the Israelites. We're going to see one more story of this happening with the Israelites, and then we're going to go into the New Testament and how this fits with us today and in the subject of spiritual warfare. Next, I'm going to go to Exodus chapter 37. And again, we're going back to the time of Moses, and this is the time of the making of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, if you know anything about the Ark of the Covenant, it contains some items that showed God's power, that showed his deliverance, and it was made to very specific specifications that God had given. Beginning in verse 1 of Exodus 37, again, I'm reading now from the NIV, Bezalel made the ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. He overlaid it with pure gold, both inside and out, and made a gold molding around it. He cast 4 gold rings for it and fastened them to his 4 feet, with 2 rings on one side and 2 on the other. Then he made poles of acacia wood and overlaid them with gold, and he inserted the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark to carry it. He made the atonement cover of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. Then he made 2 cherubim out of hammered gold at the ends of the cover. He made 1 cherubim on one end and the second cherub on the other. At the 2 ends he made them of one piece with the cover. The cherubim had their wings spread upward, overshadowing the cover with them. The cherubim faced each other, looking toward the cover. And it's interesting, when the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the tabernacle, between the 2 cherubim was where the presence of God dwelt. That was placed in the Holy of Holies, and only the high priest was able to go in there once a year. So again, the Ark of the Covenant was made to God's specifications. It was ordained of God. But let's see what happened later on in history with the Ark of the Covenant. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 4. Now, this is a time when the Philistines had attacked Israel. They were their enemies. They were always attacking them. They were always taunting them. We find that throughout Israel's history. Beginning in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 4. Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that he may go with us and save us from the hands of our enemies." Now the Israelites are being very arrogant, and what they're doing is they are really using the Ark of the Covenant just to have with them so they can have God's protection. It wasn't that they truly had a relationship with God, that they consulted God, that they prayed. They were just taking the Ark with them because they felt they would be protected. That is so typical of what we have seen. Now we see that in verses 4 through 10, actually 4 through 11 of 1 Samuel, their plan did not work out quite as they thought. So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, who is enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were here with the Ark of the Covenant. When the Ark of the Covenant, of the Lord's Covenant, came into camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" When they learned that the Ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "Oh no, nothing like this has happened before. We're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hands of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Be strong, Philistines. Be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The Ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So we see very well that their plan did not work out as they thought it would. Having the Ark of the Covenant there did no good because that relationship with God was not there. Now I'm going to tie this in a little bit to the New Testament study, and here's where we're going to get into the area of spiritual warfare. I would like to turn to 1 Corinthians 1, and I'm going to be reading in verses 10 through 17. Now this is a letter to the church in Corinth from the Apostle Paul, and in this particular area covers division in the church. Beginning in 1 Corinthians 1 verse 10, "I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree with one another in what you say, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly united in mind and thought. My brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you. What I mean is this: one of you says, 'I follow Paul,' another, 'I follow Apollos,' another, 'I follow Cephas,' still another, 'I follow Christ.' Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I did not baptize any of you except Crispus and Gaius, so no one can say that you were baptized in my name. Yes, I also baptized the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I don't remember if I baptized anyone else. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power." Now here these members of the church in Corinth were dividing themselves, and they were saying, "Well, I follow Peter, well, I follow Paul, well, I follow Apollos," and they were worshiping them rather than worshiping Jesus. They apparently had even gotten to the point of putting baptism above preaching the gospel, which is what Paul is saying he came to do. They were worshiping those people and even the baptism that God had ordained and had placed it above God himself. We see this so much in a lot of Christianity today, and I think all of us are guilty of this at some point. As I was studying this last night, I did something very interesting. I decided to look up what the word Pharisee means. And when you look up what the word Pharisee means, it actually means separated one. Now, I'd like to turn to 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 15 and 16. Now, if you think of what the Pharisees were doing, they were actually following the command of God. Now, this, of course, was written after the time of the Pharisees, but they are referring back to a verse in Leviticus 11:44 and 45, and Leviticus 19:2, where God talks about being holy. Let me read this to you. I'm going to begin in verse 13. "Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, 'Be holy because I am holy.'" Again, that refers back to the Levitical law. The Pharisees were the keeper of the law, and I believe their motives started out pure. They wanted to be holy because God is holy. The word holy and the word sanctified mean to be set apart. Apply that again to what the word Pharisee means. A separated one who has separated themselves from the ways of the world. Where did the mistake of the Pharisees happen? Well, if you think about what we have covered from the Old Testament, the Israelites began to worship something that God had ordained rather than worshiping God. In 1 Corinthians, Paul addresses that again. The people were placing more importance on who they were following and what they were doing rather than on Jesus himself. What that is called is legalism. Legalism is following such rules that we place more emphasis on the rules than we do with the relationship with God himself. And I would like to show to you that that's exactly what happened to the Pharisees. The Pharisees, of course, became very self-righteous. They became hypocritical. They became judgmental. And that is a danger that we all face. That is a spirit of legalism that does come against all of us. And it's a very real issue that we face in spiritual warfare. I would like to turn to Luke 11. And these are the words of Jesus to the Pharisees. Of course, Jesus had many encounters with the Pharisees. There were times that he was accused of working on the Sabbath because he healed. But this particular passage, I think, really epitomizes what the Pharisees were. I'm going to begin again reading from the New American Standard Bible, the NASB version. And I'm going to begin in verse 37 and go through verse 42. Now when he, meaning Jesus, had spoken, a Pharisee asked him to have lunch with him, and he went in and reclined at the table. When the Pharisee saw it, he was surprised that he had not first ceremonially washed before the meal. But the Lord said to him, "Now you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but inside you are full of robbery and wickedness. You foolish ones, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give that which is within as charity, and then all things are clean for you. But woe to you, Pharisees, for you pay tithe of mint and rue and every kind of garden herb, and yet disregard justice and the love of God. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others." So you notice what Jesus is saying, if I may stop for a moment. He is telling them they have cleaned the outside. They look good on the outside. But on the inside, they're not quite what they think they are, because again, they are worshiping the rules, what God had ordained even, in certain respects, rather than worshiping the God who made those rules. It's very interesting how that happened. Continuing in verse 43, "Woe to you Pharisees, for you love the chief seats in the synagogues and the respectful greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, for you are like concealed tombs, and the people who walk over them are unaware of it." So Jesus is telling them, you're like a tomb that's concealed, and when people walk over it, they fall in. That is exactly what legalism does. It entraps us so much that we don't even realize that it's happened. It's very concealed. Again in verse 45, one of the lawyers who said to him in reply, "Teacher, when you say this, you insult us too." But he said, "Woe to you lawyers as well, for you weigh men down with burdens hard to bear, while you yourselves will not even touch the burdens with one of your fingers. Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets, and it was your fathers who killed them. So you are witnesses and approve the deeds of your fathers, because it was they who killed them, and you build their tombs. For this reason also the wisdom of God said, I will send to them prophets and apostles, and some of them they will kill, and some of them they will persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the house of God. Yes, I tell you, it shall be charged against this generation." Now, it's interesting that Jesus worded it that way. Abel, of course, was the first murder that happened. Cain killed Abel, and the layout of the Old Testament in the Hebrew times, at the time of Jesus, was different than we have today. So the last prophet that was mentioned as killed in the Hebrew Old Testament was Zechariah. So that is very interesting how Jesus worded that. Verse 52. "Woe to you lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You yourselves did not enter, and you hindered those who are entering." When he left, the scribes and the Pharisees began to be very hostile and to question him closely on many subjects, plotting against him to catch him in something he might say. So the scribes and Pharisees began plotting against Jesus because he pointed out what they were. They were very legalistic to begin with, and that made them very self-righteous. That made them very holier than thou, so to speak. So that is such an easy temptation for us to fall into as Christians today, and that is exactly what Paul was pointing out. That's exactly what the Old Testament is showing with the worship of Gideon's ephod, the worship of the bronze snake, the using of the Ark of the Covenant as a good luck charm. That was very legalistic in their thinking. Now, I would like to end by going to Psalm 139. And this is a prayer of David that each one of us can pray, because prayer is the best way to guard against the spirit of legalism and to fight against that when it comes. I want to read verses 23 and 24. I'm going to return to the NIV version. In Psalm 139, David teaches, he prays really, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." So David is praying to God and asking him to search me and know my heart and reveal to me what's in my heart. See if there's any offensive way in me. That is something that each one of us need to do. That's a prayer that all of us can pray, and I can tell you from experience, sometimes God is going to show us things that we're not going to like. But if we truly want to follow after him, that will be our prayer, and that is a must that each one of us have. Let me read that one more time in closing. "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting."